All right, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started then. Wanted to welcome everyone thanks for taking some time out of your day today. We are happy to present the slide deck that we're going to show you on and kind of this content migration and adoption best practices and approaches for moving to O365. This is Jesse Marshall. I'm the Office 365 Solution Group leader here at Oakwood Systems in Kansas City. I think most of the folks are probably right in and around here, but we welcome many of you from St. Louis and the surrounding areas. I'm also presenting with Mickey Brewer and David Donnelly, both from Centriq and SkySync. Mickey, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. Good afternoon, everyone. And as Jesse said, my name is Mickey Brewer. I'm one of the Office 365 training architects here at Centriq Training. We have, a lot of Office 365 training, both certified and user-based. So really looking forward to sharing some content migration best practices and adoptions with you guys today. Appreciate you joining.
Thank you, Mickey. Also, my esteemed colleague, Mr. Donnelly at SkySync, the Strategic Alliances Manager. David, you introduce yourself?
For sure. Thanks, Jesse. Yep, my name is David Donnelly. I'm Strategic Alliances Manager with SkySync, actually located out of the Texas area. We primarily focus on helping both large and mid-market companies move to Office 365, SharePoint Online, and OneDrive. I'm excited to share some of the tips and tricks that we've seen to make those migrations a little bit easier. I'm glad you were all able to join us today and looking forward to sharing everything with you.
Excellent. A couple of quick housekeeping items for everyone that's attending. This session is being recorded, so this webinar will be available to all the attendees via a link post after we wrap up, and we'll send that out to everyone via the registration list. As well as if you have any questions or if you can't hear us, need us to slow down, feel free to post that into the Q&A. We're probably going to hold off on most questions and answers around the content till the end of the presentation, but Mickey, David, and myself should be able to wrap up here in about 35, 40 minutes and give you guys plenty of time to ask some questions if you want to get into the weeds on any of the things that we're about to cover today. But with that being said, let's go ahead and dive in. Just as a real quick kind of review for our three organizations, we are partners in the kind of O365, M365 now space, and myself, like I said, being a cloud solution architect and with a background in content migrations, adoption, governance, and digital transformation, modern workplace, all within the Oakwood system, Oakwood Systems banner. And Oakwood is a 40-year-old partner of Microsoft. We're gold certified. We're based out of here in Kansas City and St. Louis. And then I also want to let see some of the clients that we work with. Like I said, if you guys are either starting your Office 365 journey to the cloud, or still considering doing that move, or even in the middle of it, you're like a lot of these same clients who came to us for various reasons, but all of these clients that we've served have had questions around not only like moving users and identity, but after you get some of those bits and pieces done, what's next? How do we enable teams, and especially how do we enable the content that's right now maybe living outside of SharePoint Online or Teams or OneDrive for Business, and how do we get that up there so that we can collaborate together? Mickey, you want to talk about what Centriq does?
Yeah, definitely. We are also a Microsoft Gold partner and have been for over 25 years here in the Kansas City market. And we also have an office out in St. Louis as well. So if you are joining from outside Kansas City, I'm sure there's ways for us to partner with your company and continue your learning and adoption of Microsoft 365. And as you can see here, these are just some of the technologies that we train. We also do public classes, as well as custom classes. So if there's something custom after hearing this presentation today that you guys are looking for, and in a training partner, there's more than likely something that we can do for you. Thanks.
Thanks, Vicky. And then, Dave, you want to talk a little bit about what SkySync is and what you guys bring to the table as well?
Definitely. So SkySync's been around for about 6 years now, and the easiest way that I could describe it is we're an enterprise content integration platform. So what that means is we see a lot of migrations, and our software is very, very good for migrations. But there's also a few fringe use cases, such as being able to synchronize maybe on-premise file shares to SharePoint Online or OneDrive. As well as being able to kind of create a little bit of a system of record. So if you do have multiple different platforms in your environment, we can help connect to those and make sure that all of your content is stored in Office 365 and shared appropriately. But at the end of the day, the primary use case is always going to be, I think, migration from basically source to destination. We've got about 30 different connectors. So anything you might have out there from an on-premise or legacy ECM platform standpoint should be able to connect and bring that content into your SharePoint or OneDrive environments.
Thanks, David. So as you can see, we're coming at this from kind of three different areas. You know, me representing the consulting, Mickey represents the kind of training and enablement, and then David represents kind of the technology perspective. But we all felt the reason that we put this on the calendar, you know, way back in February of this year, it was a little bit different world. This is actually going to be intended to be an on-site lunch and learn, but things have rapidly shifted since then. But the three of us, you know, as we started to work through some of these projects over the last 18 or 24 months, we have found that there seems to be a gap in the marketplace, not necessarily around the capabilities to scope and execute migrations, but about the understanding of what is the best practice. It's very easy to find white papers on Teams enablement and how to drive adoption into O365, either from Microsoft or from the vendors and CSPs out there of the world. But the best practices when it comes to actually, how to scope and plan and execute migration of content seems to be a gap that we were running into over and over. So really what we're trying to do today for everyone that's attending is help you, about 30 to 35 minutes, bridge that gap in understanding, because this is obviously a critical element that sometimes gets kind of lost in the licensing / Azure Active Directory and Exchange hybridization. The movement of content is, if not as critical as those, more so. So we want to try to make sure that this, that we present some best practices that should help you guys either thinking about doing that or have done it and need to clean up some messes, or are just starting out in this content migration to help you, like I said, help you fill that gap. All right, so Mickey, David, and I have, and hopefully some of the folks on the phone have also heard of this concept of lift and shift, and which is, I think, a nice buzzword, summarizes what the kind of objective is for a content migration. But the problem that we see, or the couple of problems that we see, is that it not only oversimplifies what we're trying to do, but also, that fourth point on the right-hand side of garbage in, garbage out. If you're talking about a move from a file share to SharePoint Online or OneDrive for Business, if you're not doing some auditing of content and some source to destination mapping, you're basically replicating, potentially years or if not decades worth of folders and subfolders and broken / misapplied permissions, content that may be things like MSIs and installer files. There's a whole bunch of gobbledygook that's sitting in your source locations before you're doing your migration, and you've got to worry about not only like the time and effort that's involved in doing a lift and shift, because if you're trying to move 2 terabytes of all of your content, that can take a whole bunch of time. That also can drive your migration costs in terms of the license that you need to purchase for a migration tool, and your cloud space is not unlimited. OneDrive for Business for personal use is obviously starts at 1 terabyte and can go all the way up, I think, to 50 terabytes before you have to call Microsoft and explain what you're doing to them. But from a SharePoint and SharePoint being the back end of Teams, when you're talking about moving that kind of stuff into O365, that does have a cap. And even though it seems high at 2 terabytes plus whatever the change that you get for licensing your users, you're gonna reach a point where you're starting to exceed that cap space pretty quickly if you haven't, like I said, if you have more than 50 gig out on your file share. And so, like, kind of summarize, the simpler migration process, the better. But if you try to shortcut it, and you're gonna find you're gonna have problems with adoption, or at least in our experience, problem with adoption, as well as a bunch of cleanup to do after the fact. I don't know, Mickey, if you want to share your thoughts here as well, but I think this is all a concern that we seem to run into over and over, is this lift and shift approach being kind of a one size fits all for organizations, small and large.
Yeah, I completely agree. And one of the things that I would say is you're not fixing anything. So if you're going to be doing a lift and shift, or what I refer to as a forklift type of migration, you're going to inherit all the problems that you had previously, plus more, because now you're in the cloud. And if you don't have that, adoption plan in place, your users aren't going to know how to find things any more than they could find things on the network drives or any other location that your files are in. So,
agreed. If anyone is on the attendee list has done a lift and shift and just kind of robo-copied or moved wholesale file servers into SharePoint, I almost guarantee I could go ask every one of your users, and they'll, to a person, respond that they hate that UI of browsing folders and subfolders in SharePoint. It's actually almost better to keep that stuff on-prem from the user experience perspective, because folks are so used to that Windows Explorer. And there are some ways to get around that, but to our point here, the more we can audit this content and reduce the amount and audit, like I said, maybe archive some, the better we're going to be, both long-term from an adoption perspective, and you actually serve two goals there. You actually also decrease the amount and cost, amount of time and cost that it takes to get to the cloud, because you don't have to migrate all 2 or 4. Right now I'm working on one with 17 terabytes. So
it's also, think of it as spring cleaning. It's a great time at this point in time to kind of clean things up and get rid of that content that you shouldn't be holding on anymore.
Agreed. Easier said than done sometimes with users and their attachment to their beloved folders and subfolders, but definitely an exercise that's worth trying to undertake for the benefits that it can bring. So Mickey, David, and I also included this slide to kind of hopefully make this start sounding very complex and time and labor intensive in terms of auditing content and talking to your end users, to hopefully a little bit easier. So if we really think about it, your Office 365, this wheel, I think, is probably even maybe 12 months old. So some of these are even, this wheel could be even more spoke happy. But at the end of the day, we're talking about 3 primary repositories, because most of these, if you exclude Exchange from the mix, most of these are tools that are not actually repositories in O365. So when you're talking about your destinations for content, your sources could be numerous, like David mentioned earlier, from on-prem file shares to other cloud storage providers. But your actual destinations are limited to basically SharePoint, because SharePoint will backend Teams, as well as an intranet or a file share in the cloud. OneDrive for the individual, like personal, I refer to these as P drives or the user drives. And then Stream is also the kind of new, I wouldn't say new kid at the table, but a little bit under the radar. And Stream, for those of you who don't know, is the location that Microsoft has made available to store videos, almost like a company or a tenant-wide YouTube, that in terms of interface and the way you can set up channels. But that can also decrease, because while movies and M4As can be moved into SharePoint, the user experience is a little dicey, can be, at least from my experience, and the content will inevitably chew up wide swaths of your SharePoint content limit, your overall space available. Whereas if you move that to Stream, you don't have to worry about that counting against your SharePoint storage content space. Mickey, David, any thoughts to share on this one? I think, like I said, hopefully we're just trying to illustrate that you don't need to necessarily try to account for all of your Office 365 apps and tools in terms of when you're doing a migration planning.
Yeah, I just want to point out that the 3 repositories there that Jesse mentioned, Teams isn't one of them. So again, he talked about how it's kind of just an app itself, or a visual platform where your content is actually stored in SharePoint. So SharePoint is a huge product, and there's just a lot that can go into it, especially when you're talking about migration. So
yep, Yeah, we want to treat Teams as an app. Of course, there is chats and files that are stored in those, but when you actually talk about a repository, it does, the files are stored in either users OneDrive, if they're my personal files that I referenced during a chat with another user or set of users, or if I'm posting to a Teams channel, that gets stored in the SharePoint site behind the team. So the team is an app. It doesn't necessarily have a repository, even though it is, discoverable from an e-discovery, and you could set compliance rules on it. The content that we're talking about migrating would move into SharePoint and then be exposed through Teams. All right, so how do we plan a content migration? So this is kind of the meat and of the presentation here, kind of represents what Mickey and David and I have tried to put together to help, like when we were saying at the beginning, bridge the gap in understanding that we can continually run across in terms of best practices and some guidance for executing a content migration. So it really breaks down into 5 steps with a kind of inspect what you expect on the back end. So the first step, we go take inventory, and then you can map your sources to destinations. You develop your InfoSec policies, because you do want to do some of these things before you even push your first migrate button. Draft a governance plan as well. Select your migration tool, and then once you get done execution, you basically are just executing on that plan and then inspecting what you expect. Always a critical piece. Don't just trust that everything is moving. You definitely want to see what your end users are seeing before they see it or as they see it, so that you can account for changes, issues, and address them. Like I said, the expectation being that the issues that you run across are thoroughly mitigated, or at least accounted for in your planning steps. All right, so this is where the rubber hits the road in terms of the migration planning. So the inventory actually breaks down into 2 slides here, but taking an inventory is, starts with knowing what you know you have. So file shares, personal drives, even potentially individuals use their laptops or thumb drives, and then SharePoint on premises are the typical locations. I said this is not an exhaustive list. It could be other locations as well, but that typically represents a pretty healthy swath of what we're going to expect to migrate. I don't know, David, if that makes if you want to throw in anything there, but I think from a locations perspective, I'm typically looking at least from what I know I have, those 3 primary sources.
Yeah, no, I would 100% agree. I mean, I think that the majority of the clients that we see are definitely on the network file shares, trying to figure out a way to consolidate them into OneDrive. We still see a lot of SharePoint on premise. I would say that there's been an uptick recently in legacy ECM platforms. So if there are situations out there where, let's say, there's some mission critical content and the maintenance fees are just getting out of control, maybe worth a conversation as well. But yep, I would definitely agree that I think at a high level, the majority are definitely looking at file shares and SharePoint on premise.
Yep. And then you also want to take, so once you got your locations defined, you want to take account of what types of files are in those places. So this is also not an exhaustive list, but this gives you a bit of a framework to start understanding and categorizing. And really, Mickey, I'll let you jump in here in a second, but really what we're trying to do is start to identify migration candidates, so the stuff that will move, and the stuff that we are not necessarily going to nuke or delete, far be it, but we would tag those as non-migration candidates and things that we might put into, quote unquote cold storage, even if that's a file server that has IT access only, or you have to open a ticket to get at this, and then we'll grant you access. But if you break these down, you're looking at your work documents. So those would be your Office files, your PDFs, maybe even some of your JPEGs and stuff. That those JPEGs kind of blend over into your media. So you want to definitely understand what you've got from a pictures and movies perspective and where that's going to be going. Emails, PSTs, those kind of things. Email messages may be something you want to, wrap into SharePoint, but potentially not. It kind of depends on your industry and your business processes, but PSTs, probably not. There's not a lot of call for those to be in SharePoint, even though they exist in your current, file locations. And then your non-migration candidates, again, not an exhaustive list here, but things like iTunes libraries that chew up huge spaces. Usually we find these at the C levels, not to say I'm not knocking, but that is a recurring theme that we tend to run across. Personal photos, stale files, and I mean by that, it could be things like retired projects or a folder marked archive, or you could just even look at older than X year. If the last modified date was 2010 or before, that's what we call stale. Even if that represents only 10% of your total files, that still reduces your migration. And if you're talking about multiple terabytes, you could be shaving off hundreds of gigs, if not entire terabytes, by just picking a last modified date. And then installers, ISOs, EXEs, things that are definitely probably still in the mix, but maybe not. If, like I said, if you're doing an Office migration, you're upgrading your Outlook client, you may not need to keep your old installers for Visio and Microsoft Project out there. But if you did, they typically are better served in a repository managed by IT and not into SharePoint. Not to say you lose that self-service access, but there's no reason for those massive files to chew up space when SharePoint, like I said, is really geared at leveraging content that your users are going to collaborate on, which these don't fall into that category. Mickey, anything I missed there that you can think of that we usually kind of break these down in terms of inventory?
Yeah, I mean, as far as myself, Jesse, and even David's background and stuff, SkySync has great reporting aspects, some tools. There'll even be other tools that we can bring in that would give us that inventory. And as Jesse on the consulting side, that's where we would be able to provide you that data and be able to identify those locations of, hey, these file types aren't necessarily, conducive to SharePoint. This is where mission critical files are. And then maybe this is more of our just day-to-day collaboration files. So there's a couple different buckets that you'll kind of talk about throughout just the content migration in general. And there's some really good tools that are part of SkySync and part of our toolbox as far as content migration to be able to give visibility into all of this.
Definitely, and I'll let David speak to that when we get to that slide about selecting the migration tool. But your migration tool, one of the the table stakes that you should be asking for it to deliver is not only the ability to execute quickly and do some things like preserving permissions and preserving timestamps, but you should also expect it to be able to do some planning for you to help you do your inventory. And if you're not, then you need to keep looking, because there are tools out there such as SkySync that include that into the suite of the functionality. And David, I'll let you speak to that here in just a couple slides. All right, so then this is the other piece I had of the shadow here, because this is sometimes referred to as shadow IT, but you need to, from our perspective, you need to also be concerned about what you don't know you have. So these are typically the cloud storage providers like the boxes and drop boxes where marketing may be operating out of there, and they're not necessarily doing anything wrong, but they potentially needed to collaborate with a design firm, say in the course of marketing, or if it's legal, they may have some stuff stored out there because they have auditors or third parties doing reviews. All those little things that you may not take account of. This content is still your content, and from if I take off my SharePoint hat and put on my compliance and security hat, you're still going to be subject to making sure this falls into the security and compliance of your domain. So if you need to wrap rules around records management or data loss prevention policies, there's no reason to try to tackle 3 or 4 admin centers when you can build one policy in Office 365 and reduce your workload both on the build as well as the maintenance of those policies. But in order to get leverage out of that, you've got to account for bringing that content in. You don't necessarily need to execute it all in one fell swoop, but you definitely, our strong recommendation, and the thing we run into over and over as well, in addition to this kind of gap in understanding on how to execute these migrations, is look at the content that you don't know you have too, because you need to try to find that, and as much as possible, maybe some interesting discussions and some negotiations with your user groups, but you need to try to start a plan to bring that into O365 so that you can wrap your governance and controls around and not impact the end users. I know they have a preference for X, Y, and Z, but typically they're not going to these other cloud storage providers because they like the user interface or because they hate SharePoint. Now, that may be said, but hopefully that, like I said, that is more the exception and not the rule. And when you do bring these in, you get the leverage of, like I said, the one permission or one policy across all this content. And that's why, David, you can speak to this, but what did you say? SkySync has got 30 plus connectors now. So being able to inventory this content and migrate it from these other cloud storage providers that you don't know you have within your org still kind of falls within your purview from the migration tool perspective. If you want to speak to that a little bit.
100%, and that's one of the big things that we like to talk to clients about when they partner with us is really it's giving you the ability not only to be able to help with these type of moves into Office 365, but to really give you a tool to manage your files and folders across your organization, no matter where it's stored. So we've seen situations before where a client has moved from one cloud provider to another and then back to the original cloud provider with us. It really is just flexible depending on the business needs. But at the end of the day, Jesse, exactly what you were saying, the important thing is really to make sure that you have a full analysis of what you have out in your environment, how your employees are working on that, and making sure that they have access to the best tools for them to be able to do that. So, from basically a long story short, at a high level, as long as it'll benefit the business, we probably do have a connector pre-built to it for most of the stuff that's brand name.
Yep, and I have found even if you guys don't have a connector, I can usually speak to the development team and get one brewing if we need to do a home brew.
We can always get a conversation going.
That's right. That's right. All right, so those are kind of the two main parts for the inventory, and that's usually the first step. Now, this kind of bleeds right along or follows right along here. From inventory, you can go into mapping, and I don't know, Mickey, I can let you speak to the mapping. I think this is kind of where I have learned a lot from you on the mapping exercise. You want to go ahead and speak to this slide?
Sure, yeah. So mapping is probably what a lot of people that have tried to do some type of content migration where we kind of lose that information, because SharePoint has such an ability to transform your data or your content into a much better experience for your users, which obviously helps with adoption of the tool in general and gives you, really great ROI around just the purchase of Office 365. But obviously, when we're talking about mapping, we're looking at its current destination and we're looking at where it's going to be targeted, and that structure of where it currently lies and how it's set up is normally changed some way or another. It's restructured in the process itself. But what the tool can provide, as well as the consultant that's helping you do the content migration, should be well versed in just being able to identify some of the current structures that you have and just kind of changing your vocabulary almost. We're reducing folders. I'm not saying completely getting rid of them, but we're replacing the word folder with the name SharePoint site, or replacing a folder with the name of a library, or replacing a folder with a piece of metadata, or whatever that looks like. And there's obviously really easy ways between the tools to kind of get insight into what that structure currently looks like. And then the consultant would give you recommendations on that, but ultimately it is your data, right? So it's your content, whatever makes sense for your business needs. Should be a lot of conversations around that, even some surveying and things like that with your employees to get their input, to make them feel like they have some buy-in on all of this, which kind of leads into that adoption side of it. Don't just kind of come to this and say, okay, here it is, and then again, it doesn't make sense to them. It's not in a format that makes sense. But mapping in general, through Excel, through formulas, through the tool itself, it's actually gotten a lot simpler compared to what I was doing, years ago, with just the amount of time that it took to map. So.
Agreed. Yeah, this is where we're trying to basically, everyone that's listening in, break the paradigm of that lift and shift. This is where we want to actually spend. This honestly is where the bulk of the time is usually spent. Now, the actual map itself I wanted to call out there, can be as simple as that 2-column Excel spread with a source list of folders or libraries on the SharePoint on-prem side or the NFS share, and then the destination in O365. Keeping in mind that tools or Teams is a tool, not the repository. But this is where you're going to start tagging things and say that's not a migration candidate, and we're going to now collapse the marketing and the projects folder is all going to be moved to a single site, and we're going to do the low-hanging fruit first. Personal drives, P drives, those are usually the top level folder on a personal drive is a user ID. So mine is usually my J Marshall or the M Brewer on the personal drive folder. Those map perfectly over into OneDrive for Business. So that's a real easy, low-hanging piece of fruit that you can knock out, usually within a matter of a couple of weeks, and you don't have to do a whole bunch of restructuring in terms of mapping. And then your shared content too, building yourself a new modern intranet in SharePoint is not something that takes a lot of time and effort, and can basically replicate some of your top level folders at the very outset, but there's no reason why we couldn't do some of that shared content as well and knock out some of these bits and pieces so that you're not trying to chew on a gigantic 40 terabyte mess to try to get through. You can knock out half of this or a third of this by knocking out these two pieces of personal drives and shared content first. All right, and this is where some of my like backyard or my territory. So I am a big proponent of developing both the InfoSec policies as well as the governance before we start doing any moves at all. So the only reason I advocate this is that it's always required. There's always going to be some sort of information security, even if it's just a very simple like data loss prevention, where we're going to block or encrypt things where we find social security numbers or PII in there. But they can get more robust, including sensitivity, records management. Even the DLP has got options that you can get more fancy with as Microsoft matures the security and compliance suite. But the more of this we can do beforehand, the less the adoption curve is going to be impacted, the less the users are going to freak out, and you'll get a lot more compliance with this in a shorter time frame if you do this, if you spend a couple of weeks or maybe a month building this out with your team, building the policies, and then creating those policies within O365 before you push the migrate button. And then right along with this is a governance plan. So the governance plan is a little different from the information security, in that this is actually how you're going to be, your users are going to, interact with the tools. What we're going to do in terms of file restrictions. Are we going to do naming conventions? If we are, what's the recommended folder structure? How are we going to restructure permissions if we're going to do that? Or we're going to try to tackle that beast. And then also the big one, I think, is more and more folks are using Office 365 in the B2B. So how are we going to do the external access? It can really, the advances that Microsoft has made in terms of those business-to-business collaboration has really not made obsolete, but has answered a lot of the concerns that drove folks to use other cloud storage providers, 6, 12, 18 months ago. And now, if you don't account for the sharing that will inevitably occur and how you're going to control that, what policies you're going to put around it, you'll be looking at introducing unnecessary or even unacceptable levels of risk into your organization just by the way the users are used to interacting with the content, because they'll stop attaching files to emails and they'll just start chatting through Teams and attaching files there. And if that activity is known to occur, you definitely want to have a compliance policy in place, a governance plan in place. I don't know, David or Mickey, you got anything to share on those? Like I said, these are two that I think nearer and dearer to my heart potentially than yours, but because these can be more conversation driven. The actual wiring these up is not typically that labor intensive, but trying to settle on what the policies will be and how we're going to implement them and what we're going to make users do, and to comply with these right off the bat versus kind of a long-term approach can take some internal collaboration and discussion before we even wire the first policy up in O365.
Yeah, I think governance plan is a huge component that I think a lot of people kind of miss the mark on, and which for me leads into kind of the whole policy and security side of it. It's definitely a topic that we even talk about in all of our Office 365 classes, whether you're on the certification side or even on the user side. It's still topics that we talk about, best practices and things to discuss with your IT, things to discuss with your leadership. So it's a huge component that definitely has to be a part of any content migration.
Yep. Okay, but now we can actually talk about migration. So the best practices for the actual subject of this presentation. So We always, at least for me, I always recommend a migration tool. Anyone that's on the phone that has tried to do a migration and just do it via like a VM or, God forbid, a user just doing a copy and paste will know that that is both a labor intensive as well as just a maddening exercise in terms of both the time it takes and the lost productivity you get if you nominate even a couple of interns to try to do this over the course of a summer, as well as you can start losing things like, potentially you lose files, so you can lose whole swaths of content because of the the human interaction, the piece of it, but you also are going to potentially lose things like modified date and permissions if you don't do it very carefully, and those things can be critical, and you may not see that until 6, 8, 12 months down the line as well, when it really is the most unfortunate time that it can pop up. So always always advocate for a migration tool so that you're not just relying on either a robocopy or a copy and paste, even on the user's OneDrive piece. Unless the user's only got maybe 5 meg of content, I even recommend a migration tool for the user's OneDrive, because inevitably not all users are going to have just a small set of content, and you want to knock these things out quickly. Leveraging a tool like SkySync, not only gives you the ability to do that. I'll let Dave speak to the speed performance, because I think, Dave, you had that record where you migrated multiple terabytes in one night, but also your migration tool, as I was alluding to earlier, needs to come with a set of analysis tools so that you can both forecast how long it's going to take you to do your migrations, and as well, report out what content is going to be a migration candidate when you're doing your mapping and what you're going to leave behind. I don't know, Dave, you want to speak to some of the capabilities of SkySync offers here real quickly?
Yeah, 100%. So I mean, I would say that the three biggest differences between us and other migration tools, one are the amount of connectors that we have. So again, being able to really plug and play with any type of system you might have out there, as long as it's doing file and folder storage. The second is taking away the lift and shift pain that we were discussing earlier by doing what we like to call a slow walk migration, actually setting up SkySync in the background, moving that content over while employees are still able to access it and do work on it. And then whenever basically the timeline has finished, giving the employees access to, let's say for this instance, OneDrive, and having all of their content up to date. So those are two. And then the third one is definitely what you're referring to as far as the analysis feature, being able to actually run a simulation mode to see if there are any files or folders that are going to give us a hiccup before we actually start the migration. So we're not running into anything unexpected once the project's actually kicked off, as well as being able to provide a detailed report that can give you a little bit of a better breakdown as far as how much content's out there, what type of files they are, how old this content is, and creating a broader strategy on what actually should be moved over to the cloud and what perhaps we could put into some sort of cold storage. So, and Jesse, I know you've worked with these type of reports before with us, so I'm sure you could probably talk to that a lot more than even I could. But at the end of the day, you're 100% right. Just making sure that you've got a tool and a platform that's able to really handle the full project A to Z and kind of give people peace of mind while this transfer is going on.
Right. Yeah, I think the main drivers behind a lift and shift is folks just want it done and don't want to have to spend a bunch of time thinking about it, which is completely understandable. But like I said, hopefully what we've talked about thus far, illustrates some of the risks associated with that approach. And then the other piece is they just don't have the tools to be able to make any sort of intelligent or even just informed decisions about what can be migrated, how long it's going to take, and what shouldn't be. So that's why a tool should at least include that as part of table stakes, is that analysis tool, as I make in that second point on this slide. But a tool should also, as table stakes, include the ability to do things when you're doing the moves, such as apply preserve permissions or apply new permissions if you want to restructure your permissions, preserve your last modified date, things like that you may not be thinking about until after you move, especially if this is your first move and you're not planning on doing a whole bunch. For better or for worse, David, Mickey, and I have a bunch of tread on our tires when it comes to this kind of thing, so we can give you the benefit of our experience, and hopefully that's what we're doing today. The other thing that I wanted to call out from a SkySync perspective, one of the real differentiators and the reason that I elected to pursue a partnership with SkySync for our organization, is that SkySync has the ability to keep the synchronization, that last part of SkySync, Not all tools can do that. So while you're doing, day-to-day work, while you execute your migration, it may not be something, if you've got more than 50 gig or something that can be pushed over a night or over a weekend. You're going to have folks working in the files while you're actually doing the migration, preparing the destination, and you don't want to have to do multiple passes. That can be sometimes a killer in terms of lost productivity and also lost time. And so, David, I think, what was the record you guys did when you do syncing? Was it a terabyte you did in like one night, or you moved like 3 terabytes in one night? I can't remember what the record you guys got on the speed was.
It's gotten pretty crazy. We at one period of time we had, I believe it's 3 different farms of SkySync servers, and we're moving actually 60 terabytes in a day before.
Yeah, so that kind of volume shows you the capabilities of SkySync to be able to push things quickly using that cloud that can never be achieved through a robocopy or through a copy and paste. But at the same time, while that content is being pushed, if there was another 20 to move the following day, you don't have to worry about coming back through and re-updating that initial 60 gig that you pushed through that night. And that's, I think, another thing that often gets overlooked is that when you're doing these migrations, they may take days or weeks to do, and you don't want to have to do multiple passes, because that's just going to extend your time frame to completion, increase your cost, and also can really impact user adoption. All right, so just a real quick summary. Hopefully these slides made sense to everyone. If not, you can light us up here. We're going to expose our email addresses here in just a moment. And David, also, if you guys are interested, we'll be able to schedule any demos of SkySync if you'd like to take a look at the tool in greater depth. I'll put his email up here momentarily. But moving from inventory through mapping to your InfoSec and governance policies, and then selecting your tool are some of the, it's not a ton of steps you need to account for, or a bunch of hoops you jump through, but hopefully this gives you some idea of how to approach these migrations in a little bit more structured and reasonable fashion than just a lift and shift, and then do your execute and inspect what you expect while you're doing your migration. All right, so with that being said, that's most of the bulk of content on the migration best practices. We also, Mickey, I know we're running a little close to time, so we got about 12:45. Want to give at least 5 or 10 minutes for some Q&A at the end, but I know you and I also consider very near and dear to our heart how to do adoption planning, how to drive adoption, and I think you have a good kind of approach for this with the acronym of D.R.I.V.E around driving adoption. I'll let you drive through the slides. You just tell me when to move through.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. So yeah, adoption planning, just in general with any content migration or any adoption of a new platform, a new piece of software is, I think, pretty important step. I had mentioned it before, just making sure that the company as a whole, including your employees, feel like they're providing value, feel like they have some responsibility and some voice in moving into a new software, at least understand the purpose behind why they're moving into a new Office 365 environment or whatever the case may be. Unfortunately, I know some of the people that are on the call had to make that decision really quickly recently, with moving, possibly starting with Teams first. Maybe you moved your Exchange, in the past, haven't really adopted any other product, then all of a sudden, you're running through Teams and trying to get your employees up to date and all that kind of stuff. But our approach here with our partner of Jesse and both David on the SkySync and Oakwood side is just the adoption planning and making sure that it is adopting both before, during, and post migration. And of course, as part of our being a training company, and Jesse, if you want to go to the next slide. Oops, sorry.
Yeah.
Never mind.
There you go.
Yep. So our plan, as far as Centriq is concerned, we can help with that. Some of this will be, around the content and the goals and the governments, and Jesse and his team would be a part of that, using the SkySync tool as far as to gain insight into all of that. But to start that conversation with your company as a whole and as an organization, Centriq can definitely provide some assistance with that. And what's great about using the SkySync tool, and Jesse kind of alluded to it or talked about it in previous slides, is that it's not that lift and shift where all of a sudden now your employees have to work in this new environment and they've had no time to train, and they've had no time to get used to anything. SkySync providing kind of that, sync back and forth. You can take the time using this tool to provide the training to your employees as this content is getting synced, and they can continue to work in their existing environment. And then when you're ready to move into the SharePoint environment or into whatever content environment you're moving into, the content's already there, and all those changes that they had previously been doing on the network drive or on Google Drive or wherever it was that source is coming from, they're already being synced. So it's a really great tool to drive this adoption. And Jesse, if you want to go to the next one. And we're going to go through these slides here at the end just for time purposes pretty quickly. And I believe that there's some delay here in these slides, but bear with me here. But after discovery, we move into roles and to kind of come at this as an approach through this adoption is the roles. And I think they're really key, is that it's not just your IT, it's not just leadership. Some of the roles need to be change management, they need to be champions. There's Microsoft Champion program that we can definitely assist you with rolling out in your company. We need those technical experts from IT, definitely. But we also need, some of those early adopters, just people that you've seen throughout your, company that just like technology or just kind of gravitate towards understanding things a little bit faster. And we can help you identify what those roles are in your company and getting them through the correct path, the adoption plan that we have here at Centriq, and making sure that we've tailored those trainings to certain paths for each type of those roles. The next slide we have here is inform. And I've mentioned it a couple of different times that if you're not informing your users and your company as a whole, you're really just doing a disservice to just kind of flip the switch and say, here we are. I know with the environment that we've been in, some of you have had to do that, and that's fine. But moving forward, we want to just make sure that we have our goals, we have our roadmap, we have training in place, and the support in those, early adopters, supporting your IT and supporting those champions is a really important role, and Centriq can help you with that role as well. And then on the next slide here, we have values. So as far as, just making sure that you're actually getting some adoption within your organization, Oakwood and Centriq can definitely help you tap into some of the content or the metrics and the reporting tools that are already available within Office 365, as well as what SkySync can bring to the table as well, where that gap is within Office 365. So between those two tools and providing just, a report on how your adoption is working within your company and where maybe you need to focus your time and efforts on. This team needs more training, this team is doing okay, or whatever that may look like. And then the last slide that we have is the empowerment slide, or empower your users. If you don't give them that with them, that what's in it for me, you're not going to have, see results with all of that. If you don't help train and empower your users to train each other, kind of build, that support and that champion type of atmosphere, then again, it's a product that you're paying a lot of money for. You put a lot of time and effort in, and it just can kind of go down to the waste barrel like all the rest of the products that we've seen come and go within these companies. So really quickly, I know I went through those slides pretty quickly, but ultimately, I think adoption before, during, and after any type of migration or any new content for that matter, any new software is a really important part of this.
Yeah, I think what excites me about having Centriq as our training partner for Oakwood for Office 365 and even beyond is that not only can Mickey and her team, deliver whether it be in person in some of the locations in Kansas City or St. Louis, or even at your site, deliver the training that is required to enable and empower some of these end users, or if it needs to be done remotely, that's also an option. But they have a framework for actually planning, like how we're going to execute that training and how we're going to incorporate the training into the communication plan in order to make sure that the adoption is happening. And if it's not, what are the remediation steps? So they won't just have to throw up our hands and say, well, we did all our best. We sent 4 emails and we scheduled all these training sessions. Nobody came. It's an entire framework for making sure this is planned for and executed, like Mickey said, throughout the planning, the pre-stage, the post-stage, during where you're doing your migration. And I think if you look at this, if you're, I didn't put this into the slide deck, but as you can see, both from the migration perspective as well as the adoption perspective, the actual training from the end user perspective, or the pushing of the migrate button on the SkySync tool, is really just the tip of the iceberg. And I think that's the gap that most folks have, is that most folks are really familiar with how to do a migrate, like copy and paste or a robocopy, or schedule a training session and invite some users, whether they be early adopters or the the old timers that may not be super friendly toward moving to O365. But the underneath the scenes, the gap that we see is that below the iceberg, below the waterline, there are so many activities that can happen and need to happen beforehand. They don't have to take weeks and months to do. Some of those source to destination maps or coming up with a governance plan can be done in less than a week. But if you don't take account of those, you don't do those, your structure, your project is going to inevitably either falter as you execute, or even worse, it's going to look like it's going just fine, and then you come 6 or 12 months down the road and your users are revolting, or they're even worse, they're moving out of Office 365 and into other tools, introducing, like I said, unnecessary risk and cost into your organization. And that's the kind of thing that it's so easy to avoid, but without some sort of best practices, like we hope that this presentation was able to give to you over the last 45 or 50 minutes. That's really it's very challenging to do. So if you guys do have additional questions, if you want to see a demo, either of SkySync, or talk to Mickey about their training adoption, their approaches, their class schedule, any of that, or if you, like I said, even if you didn't like my my speed or cadence, want to give me some feedback as kind of the main presenter here, I'm happy to do so. Those are all of our contact infos. So please feel free to reach out, either after this, or if you think of questions or have concerns. Like I said, anyone that attended will be getting a link to this recorded webinar. But I do want to go ahead, and I think my esteemed colleague Tim, the marketing director here at Oakwood, has been doing some moderation of Q&A along with Justin on the Justin Ruby on the Centriq side, Mickey's colleague. Do you guys have any questions that came through on the chat as we were talking that we want to try to hit in the next 5 or 6 minutes here?
Yeah, I tell them I just published.
We got some questions here, and we just published a couple of them. And so if we just want to, one of the questions that was asked, is there a volume of items to move that triggers the need for a tool, or should you always use a tool? I know my answer to that, Jesse, but if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, great question. For me, there isn't necessarily, but unless you're talking about less than, say, 25 users, or maybe less than a gig of content, that might not require a tool. But I will say it this way: I've been doing migrations to Office 365 for almost nonstop for about 5 or 6 years now, and I have yet to run across a client or a customer who didn't get a benefit out of the full benefit of the license cost out of a migration tool. Mickey, what do you think there?
I agree. I've been doing this as long as Jesse has, and again, have not come across a company that has not needed some type of tool, if nothing else, for the analysis itself. So.
Right. Agreed.
All right. And then we have, what type of backup abilities exist related to OneDrive? While I know the files are safe for 30 days, we store files offsite on tape still, and would need to have the ability if we use OneDrive as well.
Really good question. Without going too technical, you've got some Office 365 backup where it's not really backup. Your files are replicated, geo-replicated, I believe they call it, twice into 2 other data centers from your Office 365 tenancy perspective. But from a pure backup perspective, like being able to go grab a version of a OneDrive that was modified last week, or the one I run to almost without fail is somebody is, I shouldn't say anymore, they get this as frequently as I used to, but somebody's at the airport, they didn't finish like uploading a file from their OneDrive through Windows 10 or whatever, and then the file got corrupted. Being able to recover that file can sometimes be very dicey without a third-party backup solution. The good news is there's several of those out there, so if that is a significant concern, I would strongly advocate for a third-party backup tool, and those usually can encompass your main storage repositories across your tenant, and by that I mean OneDrive, SharePoint, and by nature Teams as well with that SharePoint piece, as well as Exchange, for usually a relatively cost-effective license fee in terms of a third-party cloud-to-cloud backup is usually what those are called.
All right. Yeah, great. So our next question here is, I'm curious about migrating the IMAP mail in a staged way, certain users or departments at a time. Add call CALDAV. Is also interested in how the tool works coming from a Mac Centriq environment. So good question.
Yeah, good question. I probably, unfortunately, have to take that one offline because I'm not sure I can answer that even when I turn my my speed up to 11 in 3 minutes. But if I'll grab an email and I can follow up with you on that, because from the IMAP perspective, that starts to bleed between content and email migration. And not to say that there's two whole completely different approaches, but yeah, that would merit some further talking through to give you an actual anything more than an off-the-cuff answer. Good question.
And it looks like the last question, or we got two more questions here, is have you used Microsoft's the SharePoint migration tool, SPMT?
Yes, so I try not to say things if I can't say something nice, but I will go ahead and say just in my experience that homebrew tool of Microsoft leaves a lot to be desired, both on the reporting as well as the performance of it. And I have used that tool before, but I have found that in retrospect, even on a smaller org, because I only used it a handful of times, I wished I would have, and I think the client would echo my sentiments that I wished I would have licensed a third-party migration tool. That may change with Microsoft. I don't know for the folks that have how close you keep to the blogs, but Microsoft did purchase a cloud migration tool last year and are working on repurposing that. I don't have high hopes because I'm a little worried about Microsoft in this space from previous iterations of their migration tool, but we'll see what that looks like. At the end of the day, though, the advantage of a tool like SkySync over those is still going to be the reporting. What I found is that Microsoft, from the reporting and planning perspective, is not so much concerned. They've kind of left that to the ISVs, like SkySync. They've got tools that'll move it, but when you're talking about like what to move, how long it's going to take, and what not to move, which can be real critical pieces of this decision making, those are typically not included, and that's certainly true for the SharePoint migration tool, at least in my experience.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that front, because I've seen that they purchased that additional tool, and my big concern for that is going to be the version history. So just my little 2 cents on using the Microsoft tool or migration tool that's going to be coming. So.
Well, and I mean, and at the end of the day, we have file shares, SharePoint on-prem. Those are known places, so those are known repositories, and typically there is no, and David will attest to this, there's no lack of providers that will tell you they can migrate from file shares or from SharePoint on-prem. The killers where these tools don't necessarily fill that gap is the other 27 connectors that SkySync has to other cloud storage providers or other repositories, and inevitably, if you don't account for those, you have one or more of those in the mix, and then you're talking about, oh well, I got to go license one of these migration tools, or God forbid, I have someone of my devs spend 6 months trying to wire up a custom like API version or a REST call to try to move that stuff, when you could have just saved all of that time and effort by licensing a migration tool like SkySync from the outset that can account for all of those different repositories, regardless of whether they're on-prem or cloud.
Great, Jesse. So the last question I think that we have here, and I'll go ahead and answer this myself, and Jesse, you can chime in. In layman's term, what's the difference between OneDrive, Teams, and SharePoint? Well, OneDrive is obviously for that personal or one-on-one type smaller group sharing of files. SharePoint has some communication ability, but it's what I like to think of. It's the HR, it's the finance, it's the people that need the structure and that true content ECM management of files. And some of that obviously can bleed into Teams, because obviously any files that are in the background of Teams can have those policies and that security and things around them as well. But when I see Teams, I think more, cross-functional groups, the people, day-to-day activities, collaboration, and things like that. And then I just want to throw one extra in there, is Yammer. So there is Yammer. I think it has a place in an organization. And if we look at Yammer as more kind of that broadcasting or large consuming announcements and things like that, that's where I would say Yammer's place is in all of this. So Jesse, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but
Yeah, in pure layman's terms, I mean, all of these repositories have version history. They're all mobile friendly, so you can access them anywhere. All that's kind of like I said, table stakes. The way I think of it is we just think of, say, a status report, and even non-PMs that are on the mix or on the phone here have done a status report. So if I, write my status report and I have to publish it, I'm just going to walk you through this. I would write my status report, my draft, and put it in my OneDrive. And then when I was ready to, say if I had to get a budget number or a task list from another person that was working on the project, I would put that in Teams so they could add that in and we could collaborate, finish off the status report. And then when it's done, I usually, like my PMO or my manager is going to require all those to be in a place where we can all get to them and, be audited. That would go into SharePoint because then it's, even if it's just a team site, it's not shared org wide, it's now a piece of kind of shared content. So hopefully that illustrates the difference between OneDrive kind of Teams, and it's one piece of content, but as it moves through its kind of life cycle, that, those tools come into play. I don't know if that helps at all or if that obfuscates the point, but that's the way I think of it.
And that's so far all the questions we've got. So
excellent. Well, I know we're about 3 minutes over. Really appreciate everyone's time, and those were really good questions. Hopefully, you guys found some value in the things that we were able to bring to the table today, and hopefully bridge some of that gap in understanding. Like I said at the outset, if you don't feel like that was done, or you do have follow-up questions or want to see a demo from SkySync, feel free. I'm going to leave these up, and we'll also give all our contact info in a follow-up email with a link to this recorded webinar. But I'll let everyone go. Everyone stay safe, take care of yourselves and others, and I really appreciate your time.